Hello, and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie couch with Anneka Rice. Anneka's known and loved for her energetic stints presenting TV shows Treasure Hunt and Challenge Anneka in the 80s and 90s. She's been a regular on our screens ever since, as well as hosting a hit show on BBC Radio 2. Anneka's an avid painter, having studied at the Royal College of Art. In 2019, she sashayed her way through the 17th series of Strictly Come Dancing, and in 2021, she rolled up her sleeves in the Bake Off tent. Anneka lives in London and has 3 grown-up sons. Anneka Rice, welcome to the Marie Curie couch.
Thank you, Jason. It's lovely to see you.
Can I start, Anneka, today by asking if you could tell us about a significant bereavement you've experienced in your life?
I've had a number of bereavements. I've also done grief forums for Marie Curie, where I've talked to a lot of people who've been bereaved. And I think the most significant bereavement that caught me up short and from which it sort of just highlights a period of my life I've never really moved on from was actually in my early 30s, when my very best friend died very tragically. And it was around the whole time of my marriage breaking up and a lot of things happening. And honestly, I've never really moved on from that period of my life, but I've just learned to live with it, really. It's just an inherent sadness that I feel the whole time. And I know that probably sounds absolutely ridiculous, but it is just the way I am. And as I say, I've just absorbed it into my armour of life, and I just move on with it. It's sitting with me the whole time.
Well, firstly, it doesn't sound ridiculous. And I wondered whether, can you tell us about what happened to your friend?
We both had little children exactly the same age, because we did everything together. So we both had sort of 2 children under the age of 3. And she just went in for a routine operation, which went wrong and never came out of that hospital. And it was utterly devastating to me because, I suppose I'd known her since I was about 6. So she represented all my hinterland, and I had a sort of troubled childhood. So her knowledge of me and where I came from was really important to me. And when I lost that, I felt absolutely rudderless, I have to say. And I think grief's a really important thing, isn't it? Because you talk to people about grief and it leaves this terrible, terrible void. And some people fill that void, other people learn to fill the void. There's just coping mechanisms of moving on. If it's a partner they've lost, they might meet another partner, or gradually through time things sort of change. And there's no doubt that as the decades have gone on, that terrible sadness, as I say, is just something that's sort of layered onto my skin, but it is just there. It's just there. So I'm always terribly I feel great empathy for people who are sort of saddled with something they really would like to shift, but they just can't, because I totally get it.
What do you think the shift would be?
Well, for me, the way I deal with not coping with something very well, and even as I'm speaking about it, I'm thinking this just sounds ridiculous. I was in the early 30s, I'm now early 60s, surely you cope with it. But the way I deal with it, and as I say, it's something that triggers the whole time that feeling of sadness. So I have to cope with it. And it's a quote from Winnie the Pooh, Jason, that I hold very close to my heart, which was, Piglet was so excited at the idea of being useful that he forgot to be frightened anymore. I love that quote. I loved it when I was an 8-year-old. I love it now. I've loved it all the years in between. And I would say that that is my way of sort of, moving through life. I like to be doing things. I think it's really important for us as humans to feel that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves, because it makes us look outwards. Easier said than done if you're feeling very anxious and bleak, as a lot of your listeners will be. But it really does help. Just that throwing yourself into something else, which is back to filling the void, I guess, isn't it?
And that's helped you?
Definitely helped me. It's sort of like a circuit breaker. Otherwise, all those fears and that sadness sort of goes round and round and round, even though it's not logical that I feel those things, and it's ridiculous considering what the hardships most people go through. But it's just, for me, that's what I carry around with me. But I find I call it my circuit breaker. I just, if I'm in that sort of cycle, I just go and paint, or I go and I'm a befriender. I look after elderly ladies in my local community. I'll just reach out to other people. I'll just get on and do something. Or, in the old days of Challenge Anneka, I'd build a community centre. I just, I love being with that great army of volunteers. That's sort of, my happy place, if you like.
And I think your friend's death, it's so sudden and traumatic and profound and life-changing, clearly, from what you've described. And I think that's totally understandable. I'm just thinking about, depending on our relationship with the person who's died, and depending on how they've died, that's going to completely inform our experience of grief and how we grieve whoever we've lost. So, we probably won't always have the same experience of grief twice with somebody else in our life who's died, like a parent or a sibling or another friend, neighbor, because it's kind of based around our relationship with that individual. And as you describe how key she was, certainly with your, if I'm correct in what I've kind of heard, your identity and sense of self and knowing a bit about your past and your younger life. So it's kind of multifaceted, that experience, isn't it? That sudden, shocking, traumatic death.
Yeah, it was traumatic. And as I say, it was for all the reasons you've described of her being a sort of bearing witness to my life up until that moment. She just knew me, backwards. And then the other problems I was having around that same time, it's sort of just become a sort of big pivotal point of my life, from which I definitely changed at that point, and moved forward in my life feeling quite different.
I know when I'd read a bit about your experience with grief, and I know you've been an incredible supporter of Marie Curie, you talked about your parents and your father in particular, and his views on death. Can you share some of those?
Well, my father, we're quite an eccentric family, and my father was always very sort of funny about it, which I always think is a great way if you can be. This was when he was much older, obviously, and he was facing death, and he wasn't well. He had Alzheimer's, but he used to say, honestly, he used to call me Dulux, because we just looked at paint swatches all day, endlessly, because that was the way I could communicate with him. I'd go, that blue's a nice colour for your tie, Dad. And what do you think about that pink for, and then one day I said to him, what do you think my name is, Dad? And he just went, Dulux. So anyway, he said to me, Dulux, I honestly wouldn't mind going next Tuesday. And I sort of know what he means, because I've been around lots of people who've died now. And I think if you die in later age, and perhaps there is a moment where you just sort of feel exhausted by the whole act of living, possibly. Certainly, I felt that with both my parents, who I watched die. Didn't feel an unhappy thing at that point. But then, as I say, having discuss grief a lot and hosted, these Marie Curie forums on grief. I think, having spoken to experts like you and counsellors, it's a really profoundly extraordinary thing, that relationship you have with someone who's dying, especially if you're someone like yourself going into hospices trying to help people. And it just does, most of the cases that I heard, just actually sounded quite beautiful, to be honest, really quite beautiful. And I don't know, I'm very interested as well as how faith comes into all that, because I think certainly the experts on the last sort of panel I was involved with were saying that believers who felt that they were going on to a different life, onto something else, were more accepting than those non-believers, which stuffs me up a bit as I'm a non-believer. But anyway, I've got time to take up a quick bit of religion.
I think faith's an interesting one. Certainly in hospice care and in palliative care, we'd be more likely to talk about spirituality, and of course faith and religion can be a key part of spirituality for some people, but essentially it's about looking at what gives somebody's life meaning.
Yes.
So whether that's painting or music or a religion or a faith, I think that would certainly be the starting point on meeting somebody, is finding out what gives their life meaning and what's supporting them now and what's going to support them in the future. And so you were saying you're a non-believer, so thinking about spirituality and meaning, what do you find helpful in those times of grief and loss?
Well, I find huge joy in creativity. I paint and I write. I love walking and running and just being out in the fresh air. Again, I was so lucky to have a career where I just bounded around endlessly outside. And I just love that. It gives me a hit of absolute joy. So I would totally get what you're saying about spirituality. I live by the sea, so I almost I'm linked to the tides, I'm linked to the sunsets and the sunrise and nature, just, the rhythm of nature, which I find very profound personally. So I suppose that would be my religion.
Yeah, I love that. I'm a huge fan of the sea as well, and just kind of water, rivers, and I think that's exactly the kind of conversation we would be having with somebody who was either dying or living with a terminal illness, to get a sense of what gives them meaning, so we can support them to kind of seek those things out, to help them along the way, as it were. I just wanted to, you mentioned earlier about conversations about death. So when your dad said, I wouldn't mind going next Tuesday, but just sort of before that, throughout your life, have you been quite open about talking about death and dying? What messages when you were younger did you get about death and dying? Was it something that was kind of hidden?
Yeah, I don't think anyone discussed death and dying when I was younger. Maybe it's a different generational thing, but I'm much more open with my sons. I mean, I think they've got very good instructions on what to do with me, because they know I'm so obsessed with, we call it in our house, I suppose our religion is the glory of the evening light. That's what we call it, and it stems from, as little children, we always live in a house where the sun sets on the water, and there's a sofa that when my boys were little, we'd just lie on this sofa and be bathed in this evening light, and it was just the glory of the evening light. And I'm absolutely, I'm very strict about the celebration of that glory of the evening light. I won't do anything while that amazing transformation is happening from the day ending and the evening started. It's a really significant time for me, and so I'm sure if there's any kind of plaque that my kids put up anywhere, it'll just say the glory of the bloody evening light, because it's just such a family thing. And, we have a WhatsApp group. We get in touch and share photos of their glory of the evening light where they are. And it's just our thing. So that's almost our religion, I guess. So, yes, they know that whatever happens to me when I die, the glory of the evening light will be involved in some way.
I love that kind of WhatsApp group as well, just sort of sharing, everybody's different experiences of the glory of the evening light.
I know, you can join it if you like. You could be a guest member for a couple of weeks. We'll give you a go, Jason. See what you can bring up to the party. But it is a lovely way to connect, because we all are all over the place the whole time through work and whatever. And it's just just a different way of connecting, isn't it? To share, how that early evening is for you.
So it sounds like you've had some open conversations with your sons about not necessarily your own death, but that, death and dying is something that can be spoken about in the family.
Yes, I mean, we were very lucky because there's an undertaker's on the corner of our house. So when both my parents died, we brought their bodies up to London. They weren't in London, and we had them at the local undertakers, literally a 2-minute walk away. Chose to have a sort of a cardboard coffin so that nieces, nephews, everyone could pile into the undertakers with felt tips and glue, and we made the most amazing. Oh, we did those coffins so beautifully. Almost the best artwork I've ever done. We just emblazoned with Grandad's The Greatest down the side. And when the coffin moved through our village, to go to the crematorium, which is also conveniently local, people were just clapping on the pavement. And it was just so joyful. And we even had a picnic. I don't think we were meant to, but we just took a bit of a picnic in and sat with the coffin. This was with my dad. Doing a bit of craning, bit of chatting. And again, it was just a nice transition. It was like that glory of the evening light transition. I like a transition. It was a transition from feeling terribly sad and, all those feelings you might have into a feeling of celebration. And being there with the coffin was just such a great transition for it. So by the time we got to the crematorium, we were just pumped up with the joy of Grandad being the greatest. And, it was fine.
I love that. And just also kind of everybody being involved.
Yeah.
I got that real sort of community sense when, you were talking about people standing at the side of the road and clapping because, of course, seeing these incredibly colourful, wonderful coffins. And it wasn't actually that long ago when death was a community business. It's kind of somebody local would make the coffin and, others would be involved and people would help out with whether it was bits of food or, but everybody had a role and it was talked about more. And then it sort of shifted, I think, and people talk about the medicalization of death.
And also, we're also atomized. We just lead our little lives, don't we? And we're not all, I just love community. Doing the challenge program has taught me that, and that's how now I like to live life. As I said, I like to feel part of something much bigger than myself. Our local community association is called FISH, and it stands for Friendship, Independence, Support and Help. And it collects all the elderly in the area, a huge area as well, because I'm talking about London. And those old people are so supported and loved by this massive team of volunteers and befrienders. And, especially during COVID, it was the most sort of touching thing I've seen, how the lengths people would go to try and keep that contact going. And there was a desperately sad situation with one of the elderly ladies I'm in touch with, whose whole life centers around her budgie. I mean, this is why I think grief, takes so many different forms. This budgie was her life. It was the reason she got up in the morning, the person she spoke to and played music to. And during COVID, the budgie came ill and she was desperate, and no one at that time could get round to support her as we would have liked to. And the budgie died. And I've never ever for a long time experienced such grief, someone absolutely broken by this little bird. And it was desperate because it was during COVID. But all these amazing volunteers just supported her, sent so much love. We all just tried to do little things we did. I painted a watercolor of her budgie and just dropped it round.
Oh, how nice.
Other people baked, other people, just it was really amazing to see.
The coronavirus pandemic has triggered a wave of bereavement across the country and taken away our ability to be with loved ones and grieve in traditional ways. Marie Curie's new Memory Cloud is an online space to reflect on a loved one's life and share special memories with your friends and family. Visit memorycloud.org.uk.
On the subject of that gang through Fish, this fantastic organisation, I once had 3 of my favourite elderly ladies round for lunch, which was quite a performance, just getting them all into the house with various walking aids and steps. And it was an adventure. Anyway, they all came around for lunch and I made them a pie. And then after lunch, I got them talking about their funerals. They're all in their late 90s. And I put my speaker in the middle of the table, which, is quite a modern thing. If you're 97, you haven't seen one of those before. And I just said to the first one, Stefania, what would you like played at your funeral? And that they all loved opera, so it was an aria of some kind. And I put the music on, and this music just filled the kitchen. And oh my goodness, they could not believe this sound came out of this little black box. And it was the most touching hour and a half I've had, I think, for a long time, because one by one, they just talked about their funerals and their music and why that music was important to them. And it was beautiful. It was slightly broken by my son coming home from wherever he'd come home from, who's very good looking, I have to say. And Anneka, he's easy on the eye, at which point the whole thing collapsed. But up to that point. But then Sam was great because he plays the piano. So he then went and played the piano for them. And it just became this lovely open discussion about funerals and death in a way. And that, I suppose that was sort of my way of broaching the subject, because it is a subject that's sort of good to talk about, isn't it?
Absolutely, but I think, that's a really beautiful story, and it sounds absolutely lovely. And I'm just kind of thinking the way my head works. I'll be thinking, well, had they documented that? Had they written it down? Did people know what their wishes were? But actually, that's not the point of it. The point was, as you said, it's about opening up a conversation about it, isn't it? It's about opening a conversation about death, funeral wishes, life, reflection. What do you think the women got out of that, Anneka?
Do you know, I think it was a moment of real touching sisterhood, actually. I'm not the same age as them. They don't particularly know each other that well. They're part of the same charity, the organisation that helps them, but they're not intimate with each other. It was a moment of real bonding for the 4 of us to talk about something so profound. And I think it was very happy and really nice to discuss a bit of Wagner and explain why it's so important. One of the ladies was Italian, one had been a prisoner of war in Poland. All sorts of life stories came out of it. It was like sort of Desert Island Discs with funerals. In fact, can I please patent that as an idea as an offshoot for Marie Curie? Because it is a lovely way to talk about death, which is so much about life, isn't it? It's all entwined, really. And I think when you're in your late 90s, it feels near, but not frightening for these 3 ladies anyway.
I think beginning the conversation can be really difficult, and I think kind of regardless of what age someone's at. But if somebody's living with a terminal illness, and there's family or friends or neighbours, anybody who's significant around them, having those conversations can be really tough, and even just starting them off. And I think actually funeral songs or music can be a great opener.
Well, I have to caveat that with the fact that, I was discussing this with one lady who was 97, one was 100. And, it's a very different conversation from the most poignant conversations you'll be having with younger people with terminal illnesses. And that is, I don't at all pretend. I'm talking about it rather glibly, and I don't want it to come across like that, because, my involvement was just with these three ladies, and it sort of worked for them at that time. But the work you guys do is, on another level.
Can I just go back to, I've still got the image of your dad's painted coffin in the car on the way to the crematorium. And I just wondered what happened with his ashes, if anything.
Now, the ashes are a bone of contention, because Dad is on the mantelpiece at the moment and my mum is under the snooker table, and I've done nothing with them. I've been waiting to plant a tree. I got it all planned that I'm going to make a little bit of remembrance garden, but we're in the process of moving home, and I just want to make sure I've got the right bit of garden. There's going to be a sort of longevity to the whole thing. So, I'm very aware that I haven't done the right thing with their ashes. We did a bit with my dad. My sister and I, we divvied some of them up, and we went with all the kids and nieces and nephews on top of we found this tor on the top of Dartmoor where my dad used to go horse riding. And we found a tor called Laughter Tor. And because he was just such a laugh and so eccentric, we thought this has got to be the place. And of course, we tossed all these ashes into the air. There was a huge wild wind, and they just sort of clung to our anoraks and our hair. And again, it was sort of funny, and Dad would have honestly found that amusing. A slight lack of reverence, but again, you're talking about someone who's died at a very, my dad was in his 90s, so there's just not that element of absolute pain surrounding the whole thing. So it did go into slightly Monty Python, frankly. And I've said to my sons that when I die, I want them to divide my ashes up into paint pots and then paint a picture, mixing the ashes with the paint or any old thing. And that would be a nice thing. I've always thought that'd be a nice thing to do, is to paint a painting for someone using the person's ashes, give that to their family.
Did your parents leave instructions on what they wanted after their death?
No, not at all. No, not at all. A different generation, as I say, they didn't, apart from my father, so, in old age, discussing it a bit in a wouldn't mind going next Tuesday kind of way. There was none of that openness that hopefully we all have now.
So you said you've spoken to your sons about some of your wishes, and my next question is: have you done anything a bit more practical about that? So have you documented anything yourself, or have you written a will, or written your wishes down, or an advanced care plan?
No, I haven't, is the absolute embarrassing answer to that. I've got a will that's so out of date as to be embarrassing, but at least it names my children in it. But I think that's something I should look forward to doing, because it is a really lovely thing to receive something from someone who's died that's significant. I've lost, honestly, a lot of friends. And Paul, there was a man called Paul Whittam, who was a great, great friend of mine, lived in Norfolk, and he was a hotelier. And in his will, because he knows that basically I like being in bed. I just love my bed. It's a very significant place for me. It's where I feel most safe. And, I go to bed as early as I possibly can without it sort of practically being in the middle of the morning. And so in his will, he left me bedding for not only my bed, but every bed in the house, with duvets, pillows, beautiful, beautiful white, crisp duvet covers and sheets and pillowcases. And there's not a day goes by when I don't think of Paul. Just think of him. He's and he's just a lovely man. I'm very close with him and his wife, Jeanne. I'm a godmother to one of his daughters. Isn't that a lovely idea?
It's so nice.
Something really practical. It just made my heart burst when this delivery, this lorry sort of arrived with all this bedding all in huge cardboard boxes. And as I say, every day I think of him. So that's a very lovely example of something very special to do, isn't it?
It's a really lovely thing. And I think that kind of, as well as, leaving a gift, but just also, I think if we don't write things down, the risk is, we might think, oh, well, I've told my sons what I want, or I've told such and such exactly what I want. Can't really guarantee they're going to remember it all. And so I think it can be incredibly helpful, as well as leaving gifts. If you have gifts to leave, it can also be incredibly, just on a practical level, very helpful for those who are grieving after somebody's died, to know what the wishes were. And in that decision-making process, because there's lots of decisions you have to make when someone's died as well.
Yes, no, it's a very good point. And I think the point that I'm thinking, listening to this, is at what point, when you're in your 30s, you think you're far too young. When you're in your 40s, you think you're far too young. You go through each decade thinking you're far too young. And there just has to get a point where you think, come on, get on with it, Rice, just do it. But it is, thank you for this, Jason. That's my homework. I'm going to devise some kind of treasure hunt, I think is the word. Not going to make it easy. I think there might be clues involved.
That's great. But I think for you and for people listening, it's absolutely, I totally get that kind of, if you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s, it's like, oh, well, why would I want to be thinking about that? But it is incredibly helpful, and it is something practical. And actually, you could do it in an afternoon or a couple of hours, and then it's done. And then you don't have to think about it again.
You don't have to go to a solicitor. You can just write it on your computer, write it in longhand, and then sort of just lodge it with someone legal. But, you don't have to, there's something sort of weirdly litigious surrounding it, isn't there? But there needn't be.
Yeah.
It can just be a letter of love and intent.
Yeah, or a treasure hunt.
Oh, treasure hunt. I think you're warming to that theme. I think we've got a couple of formats out of this chat, Jason.
Can I just, for our listeners, we know people will often find comfort in listening to the podcast, find it supportive hearing other people's experiences of grief and bereavement. And you've mentioned a couple of things, Anneka, about what has helped you in times of grief. But can you talk a bit more about your experience of bereavement and the things that have most helped you?
Well, I think at times, I'm going back to my 30s again, because this is just the sort of pivotal time, because I've had, we all have lots of setbacks in life, but because that's the period of time I've never really moved on from. And my experience was of being a sort of, I just remember pacing up and down for days, and that seemed to go on into weeks, which seemed to go on into months. I had two very small children, so I was tethered by that, and we became this really close little unit. And so I had, I was being a mother to them. So that was what I did. And my way of dealing with it at the time was just to hunker down with them, to make life very small just while I was dealing with this, and not even think beyond the four walls, and just make each day just about very practical little things about the glory of the evening light each evening, what we might have for tea, which fairy tale, which story we might read at bedtime. And I just made it very little, and then gradually expanded it to a bigger day, until finally, I moved out, and then realized that actually one really good way of dealing with it was to reach out and find, again, that thing that's bigger than myself. So reach out into the community. And I was, that it tied in with the series challenge. So boy, did I get thrown into a big community projects. And that really became my life's work. I absolutely seized on that. And that was such a good coping mechanism for me. It was just something so practical I could do. And I met hundreds and hundreds, thousands of volunteers, people going through the most terrible things. And it was just so fantastic to be part of this huge volunteering team. And that is what I do. That is how I lead my life, really. Back to Piglet. You know, it's not being frightened because you're being useful.
And provided you with an opportunity, as you've also said, to look outwards.
Yeah.
What advice would you give someone who was going through that, Anneka?
I think know that you're loved, and, you know, reach out to people who love you and would love to help, perhaps. I mean, everyone's circumstances are so different. Again, it just feels sort of wrong to try and offer up any kind of advice, because people will just be getting through it in the way that they can. But you know, talking to friends of mine who are going through really very sad times at the moment, what does seem to have helped is that circuit breaking thing of taking themselves out of their situation into something else, whether it's cooking or painting or going for a walk or making a phone call, or being practical. But I feel they're very small crumbs of comfort. What would you suggest, Jason?
It's really helpful. I think along the lines of what you've said, you know, is looking after the physical as well as the psychological. And so, you know, things like eating regularly, and, as you say, getting out for a walk or making sure you're kind of exercising, reaching out to people. If there are people around you, if there's no one around you to reach out to, talk to, ask for support and help from, then there are masses of organizations out there as well. I think you know, we can also people can access.
I think that's key. I had no idea all this help was available. You know, when my parents both had Alzheimer's, I had no idea there was an Alzheimer's organization at that time. It was sort of before we were all much more talkative about all these issues. You know, we're now talking about all sorts of things, aren't we, in a way, a couple of decades before no one really did. Oh my goodness, and Marie Curie, oh my goodness, the help and support they can offer you. You know, there's organizations, listening charities that will be so happy just to listen in a gentle and kind way. So yes, definitely reach out. I think you'll be amazed at the glorious people out there like yourself, Jason, who are just there to help. It's only a 4-letter word, help, but it's there. And I think you're absolutely right. Organizations, pick up the phone and talk to someone if you can.
Just to finish, what's it meant to you today to come on the Marie Curie couch? Well,
as I said, I'm a great supporter of Marie Curie, so I just feel really chuffed to have been asked, and I'm very aware that most of my chat will be very trivial compared to the problems most people are facing. But you know, if there's one sort of small bit of advice that along the way, or experience that it chimes with someone, you know, it's just good to talk, isn't it? It's just good to talk.
Anneka Rice, thank you for joining me on the Marie Curie couch today, and thank you for sharing your stories. It's been great to meet you.
Thank you, Jason.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help. From planning ahead to coping with bereavement, you can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 080 2309 or search Marie Curie online. The podcast's produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Sound and Vision, and the music featured is Time Lapse by Panoceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.